The people of Copper Ridge always said their valley carried stories too strange to be believed. Tales whispered over bar counters and front porches of lives changed in an instant by moments no one could explain. Most folks laughed them off as campfire talk. But on a frostbitten October morning, one such story came alive, and it began with a ranch hand named Dillon Cross. Dillon wasn't a man anyone would have called lucky. At 38, he bore the weathered look of someone who had lived through more defeats than triumphs. His hands were hard and scarred from years of wire cutting and fence mending. The deep lines across his face told the story of sleepless nights worrying over bills he could never quite pay. 3 years earlier, with nowhere left to go, he'd been taken in by old Benjamin Whitmore, who offered him a rundown cabin and steady ranch work in exchange for sweat and loyalty. The Whitmore ranch wasn't much. 1,000 tired acres of Montana grassland, its pastures thinning with weeds and fences leaning like worn-out shoulders. But for Dillon, it was salvation, a place where he could start over, even if his life had narrowed into nothing but early mornings and lonely evenings. That morning, the mist rolled heavy over Copper Ridge, clinging to the earth like a gray shroud. Dillon moved along the sagging fence line with his grandfather's dented toolbox. He liked the quiet. The slow, methodical work kept his mind from drifting toward darker corners of memory. He paused now and then to tighten a post or splice a strand of broken wire, his breath puffing in clouds against the chill. Then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind moaning through the pines. But there was something in the sound that made the hairs rise along the back of his neck. A rawness. A pain. He stopped walking, cocked his head, and listened again. The sound came a second time. Low and labored. The uneven breathing of something large. Something alive. Setting down the toolbox, Dillon pushed through the underbrush, boots crunching over damp leaves. The further he went, the louder it grew, a hollow clinking of metal against wood, woven into those ragged breaths. He forced his way through a thicket of serviceberry bushes and stumbled into a clearing. There, beneath an enormous oak tree that had stood for centuries, lay the sight that would haunt him forever. A horse, the biggest he had ever seen. The animal was collapsed at the base of the tree, its body enormous, its coat so black it seemed to drink up the weak morning light. But what made Dillon's stomach twist were the chains. Thick iron links wound around its neck and chest, fastened to the oak like some medieval punishment. The metal had bitten into its flesh, leaving open wounds weeping with infection. Its ribs pressed through its skin, sharp and desperate. Each breath rattled like the final notes of a broken bellows. For a moment, Dillon couldn't move. The sheer size of the horse was staggering. 18 hands at least, maybe more. But it wasn't the size that froze him. It was the eyes. Amber eyes, wide and filled with something that reached past language. A plea. A question. And then Dillon saw the scrap of paper tied to the chain. Hands trembling, he tore it loose and unfolded it. The words were scrawled in a hurried hand, blurred by water stains. His name is Goliath. I can't care for him anymore. He's too big, too wild, too much trouble. Maybe someone else can save him. I'm sorry. There was no signature. Only regret etched between every letter. Dillon stared at the note, his chest tight. Rain or tears, it didn't matter. Someone had left this magnificent animal here to starve. The smart choice, the practical choice, would have been to walk away. To call the sheriff, to let animal control decide the creature's fate. Dillon could barely afford to feed himself. How could he possibly take on a horse that might eat its weight in hay? But those amber eyes locked onto him, holding his gaze with desperate clarity. Not the wild panic he might have expected, but a weary, intelligent awareness. As if the animal were asking, "Are you here to help me? Or will you leave me to die, like the others did?" Dillon knelt in the cold earth beside the horse's massive head. His voice was quiet, almost unsure when he whispered, "I'll get you out, boy. I don't know how yet, but I'm not leaving you here." The horse's ear flicked faintly, and in those weary eyes Dillon thought he saw a spark kindle. A fragile flicker of hope. He rose quickly, his mind already racing. The chains were thick, anchored with a rusted padlock. It would take more than bare hands to break them. Dillon sprinted back toward his cabin, lungs burning, and returned with every tool he could find: bolt cutters, hacksaw, pry bar, even a pair of rusted wire cutters. The work was slow, grueling. Each cut, each twist of metal echoed in the cold clearing. More than once, Goliath flinched and tried to struggle, the chains biting deeper into his wounds. Dillon soothed him with a low, steady voice, the same tone his grandfather had used on spooked cattle. He spoke about the ranch, about open pastures and clean streams, about barns filled with hay. Whether or not the animal understood the words didn't matter. The sound calmed him. Link by link, the prison fell away. Hours passed until finally, with a final metallic snap, the last chain clattered to the ground. But freedom didn't come in a rush. Goliath lay still, his great sides heaving, as though he couldn't quite believe it. Dylan sank back onto his heels, sweat damp on his forehead despite the chill. Then slowly, painfully the horse stirred. His first attempt to stand failed. His massive legs buckled, dropping him back into the dirt. Dylan's heart clenched. But Goliath tried again, forcing strength from somewhere deep inside. With a grunt of effort, he pushed upright, swaying dangerously until at last he steadied. Dylan expected him to bolt. Any normal horse would have fled the moment the chains fell. But Goliath didn't run. Instead, he turned toward Dylan, amber eyes fixed on him, and took a slow step forward. Then another, until the man could feel the warmth of that massive body before him. Very gently, Dylan reached out a hand. The horse lowered his head, and Dylan's rough palm met the velvet of his muzzle. In that touch, something passed between them. A bond. A recognition. Two broken souls meeting in the cold morning mist, daring to trust again. "Come on, Goliath," Dylan murmured. "Let's go home." The journey back to the ranch was only half a mile. On a normal day, it would have taken minutes. But Goliath was weak, his breath ragged, his legs trembling after every few steps. They walked together slowly, Dylan keeping close, encouraging him forward. More than once he thought the horse might collapse, but every time Goliath found the strength to continue. 2 hours later, they finally reached the weathered barns of Whitmore Ranch. Dylan glanced at the skeletal pastures, at the leaning fences, and for the first time in years, he didn't see only ruin. He saw possibility, a place where maybe both man and beast could begin again. And so began a story that would not only change Dylan's life, but ripple through the whole valley. A story of second chances, of healing, of an unlikely giant who would teach a broken ranch hand what it meant to hope again. By the time Dylan had led Goliath into the barnyard, his arms and back ached from the slow march. The horse swayed on unsteady legs, head lowered as if every step had cost him the last of his strength. Dylan guided him toward the old barn, praying the structure could serve as shelter. The barn hadn't housed horses in years. Dust coated the beams, and the wooden stalls leaned with age. But it was the only place that could offer warmth and safety. Dylan pushed open the heavy doors, their hinges groaning, and coaxed the massive animal inside. Goliath stopped in the center aisle, his amber eyes sweeping over the dim interior, his ears flicking at every sound. He didn't bolt. He didn't resist. He simply stood patient, as if he understood that this was the beginning of something new. Dylan scrambled to make a stall habitable. He patched broken boards with loose planks, shoveled away years of dust, and spread what straw he could find across the floor. Then he dragged buckets, filling them with water from a hose, and hauled in the last of the hay stored in the loft. It wasn't much, but it was something. By the time Dylan was finished, sweat dampened his shirt despite the chill. He leaned against the stall door and looked at Goliath. The horse was skeletal, his hide stretched tight over bones, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself. When he lowered his head to nibble at the hay, Dylan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this giant could survive. That evening, Benjamin Whitmore returned from town. The old rancher was 72, wiry and bent with years of hard labor, his eyes sharp as flint beneath bushy brows. He stepped into the barn and froze. "What in God's name?" he whispered, staring at the enormous black horse standing peacefully in the stall. Dylan explained everything, the sound in the woods, the chains, the note, the fight to bring the animal home. When he finished, Benjamin walked slowly to the stall, extending a weathered hand. Goliath turned his great head and allowed the man to stroke his neck. "I've seen plenty of horses in my time," Benjamin murmured, his voice softer than Dylan had ever heard it. "But this one, he's different. This isn't just another animal. This is once in a lifetime." Dylan swallowed hard. He had half expected the old rancher to tell him to get rid of Goliath, that they couldn't afford another mouth to feed. Instead, Benjamin looked at the horse with something like reverence. But then his eyes shifted to Dylan. "Son, caring for him won't be easy. He'll need feed, a vet medicine. It'll cost more than you make in a year. You sure you're ready for that kind of burden?" Dylan glanced at Goliath, who stood with his head lowered, eyes half closed, as though finally at peace. The wound still wept, his ribs still showed, and Dylan had no idea if he'd even live through the week. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. "I'm sure," he said quietly. The first week nearly broke him. Dr. Patricia Vance, the county veterinarian, visited every other day. A blunt, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, she examined Goliath's wounds and gave Dylan a list of instructions longer than his arm. "He's malnourished," she explained as she cleaned the infected cuts. "His digestive system's in shock. You can't just pour feed into him. Too much too fast could kill him. He needs small, steady meals. Antibiotics for the infection. Careful monitoring. And even then, there's no guarantee he'll recover." Dylan listened, nodding, writing every detail down as if instructions were sacred law. He slept little, waking often check on Goliath, to refill water buckets, to coax him to eat handfuls of grain or mouthfuls of hay. He cleaned the wounds daily, his hands gentle, his voice low, as he worked. And all the while he talked. Not about anything important, the weather, the state of the fences, childhood memories. He hadn't spoken aloud in years. He told Goliath about the stars above the ridge and the way the river glittered in summer sunlight. The horse seemed to listen, his ears flicking toward Dylan's voice, his amber eyes steady and calm. Day by day, the horse began to change. His breathing grew steadier. His coat, once dull and lifeless, began to shine faintly. The sharp edges of his ribs softened as his body accepted regular food. The wounds healed, leaving deep scars but no more pain. Most remarkable of all was the shift in his spirit. At first, Goliath had stood quietly, almost resigned. But as the days passed, sparks of life returned. He would nicker softly when Dylan entered the barn. He tugged playfully at Dylan's sleeve with his teeth. And one crisp morning, Dylan watched in awe as Goliath trotted across the pasture, his tail high, his massive frame moving with a grace that stole the breath from Dylan's chest. It was like watching a ghost come back to life. Word spread quickly through Copper Ridge. Neighbors heard whispers of the enormous black horse rescued from death. Curious folks began to drive by the Whitmore place, hoping for a glimpse. The stories grew in the retelling. Some claimed the horse was untamable. Others said he was a miracle. One Saturday, Emma Rodriguez arrived with her young daughter, Lisa. The child had been withdrawn since her parents' divorce, speaking little, her shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. At first, Lisa clung to her mother's hand, staring at the massive animal with wide, frightened eyes. But Goliath seemed to sense her presence. He lifted his head from the grass, studied her, and walked slowly across the pasture until he stood at the fence before her. He lowered his muzzle, patient waiting. After a long hesitation, Lisa reached out with a trembling hand. Her small fingers brushed the velvet of his nose, and something shifted in her. Her shoulders straightened. Her lips curved in the smallest of smiles. From that day forward, she begged her mother to bring her back every weekend. She would sit for hours, whispering secrets into Goliath's ear, her laughter ringing across the pasture. Dylan watched in quiet awe. It wasn't just Lisa. Others came too, troubled teenagers, grieving parents, weary old men. And time after time, Goliath met them with the same patient strength, the same uncanny ability to give them what they needed most. One evening, Dylan found Marcus Williams, a local teenager known for drinking and petty theft, sitting in Goliath's stall. The boy's shoulders shook as he spoke in a halting voice, confessing fears, regrets, and promises to do better. Goliath rested his massive head in the boy's lap, listening, as if he were a priest hearing confession. When Marcus finally fell silent, tears streaking his face, the horse nuzzled him gently. That night, Dylan realized the truth. Goliath wasn't just surviving. He was healing, not only himself but everyone who came near him. And though Dylan hadn't admitted it aloud, he was healing Dylan most of all. For the first time in years, Dylan awoke each morning with a sense of purpose. The work was endless, the expenses crushing, but none of that mattered. In Goliath's presence, the broken pieces of his life no longer felt like dead weight. They felt like the foundation of something new. He often caught himself laughing, real laughter, the kind he hadn't felt in years. He found himself talking with neighbors again, answering their questions about Goliath, even sharing his own knowledge of care and training. To his surprise, people listened. They respected him. For the first time, Dylan began to feel like he belonged. Late one night, as he brushed Goliath's gleaming black coat, he whispered, "I thought I was saving you, boy. But maybe you're saving me." The horse blew softly through his nostrils, warm breath brushing against Dylan's cheek, as though in agreement. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was only the beginning. Goliath's story and Dylan's was about to spread far beyond Copper Ridge, reaching hearts in places they never imagined. By late November, Copper Ridge buzzed with whispers about the giant black horse that had been rescued from chains and starvation. Some called him a miracle, others said he was cursed, but everyone wanted to see him. Dylan, who once kept to himself and avoided attention, now found strangers showing up at the ranch gate almost daily. And still, Goliath welcomed them all. He had an uncanny ability to sense what each person needed. For children, he was gentle and patient. For broken men, he stood like a silent friend. For anxious souls, he exuded calm. It was as if the horse carried a wisdom beyond words, as though he'd been born to shoulder the burdens people couldn't carry alone. One Saturday morning, Dylan noticed a car pull up, kicking gravel along the dirt road. A family stepped out. A father, a weary-looking mother, and 2 children. The younger, a girl of about 7, clung to her mother's coat, her eyes wary and guarded. The father explained quickly. Their daughter had suffered terrible nightmares since a car accident months earlier. No doctor or therapist had helped, but they'd heard about the horse. Dylan hesitated. He wasn't a healer. He wasn't a counselor. But before he could answer, Goliath lifted his head and walked toward the family, his amber eyes fixed on the little girl. The horse lowered himself carefully onto the straw by the fence, lying down, making himself small, less frightening. The girl blinked in astonishment. Slowly, she let go of her mother's hand, stepped forward, and knelt beside the giant. Her small fingers brushed the smooth black coat. And then she began to talk. No one could make out her words, but her voice spilled out in a quiet, steady stream, a voice her parents hadn't heard in months. She whispered to Goliath for over an hour, her head resting against his side, her shoulders relaxing as if the nightmares had lifted. When she finally stood, her eyes were brighter, her face lighter. Her mother wept openly, clutching Dylan's hands. "I don't know what this is," she said, her voice breaking, "but thank you. He's given us our daughter back." Moments like this repeated again and again. Each time, Dylan was humbled. It wasn't him, it was Goliath. The horse healed without medicine, without words. He simply gave people what they needed most, acceptance. And the strange truth was, Dylan himself was changing just as much as the visitors. He had lived for years in a shell of silence, weighed down by regrets and failures he never spoke of. But now, people sought him out, not just to see the horse, but to hear Dylan's stories, to ask his advice, to thank him for the kindness of sharing Goliath. For the first time in a long while, Dylan felt seen. Benjamin Whitmore noticed, too. The old rancher would sit in his rocking chair at dusk, watching the line of cars that came down the road. He saw how Dylan spoke with strangers, how he carried himself differently now. Not the hunched, weary man of 3 years ago, but someone with purpose, someone alive. "You've found your calling, son," Benjamin said one evening as they watched Goliath grazing against a sunset sky. "This isn't just about one horse anymore. It's bigger, much bigger." Dylan wasn't ready to admit, but deep down, he knew the old man was right. The real turning point came in early spring, when a family arrived with their 12-year-old boy, Kevin. Kevin had been born with cerebral palsy and had never walked without assistance. He was bright, cheerful, and fiercely intelligent, but Dylan saw the longing in his eyes as he watched other children running free. At first, Goliath approached Kevin like he had others, with calm curiosity. The boy reached out from his wheelchair, stroking the horse's muzzle, smiling wider than his parents had seen in weeks. But then something remarkable happened. Goliath moved to the pasture gate and stood there, glancing back at Dylan with a look that seemed almost purposeful. Dylan hesitated, then opened the gate. The horse walked straight to Kevin, lowered himself into the grass beside the chair, and lay perfectly still. Kevin's parents gasped, unsure, but the boy's eyes lit with understanding. "He wants me to ride," Kevin whispered. The process was slow and difficult. Kevin strained, his small body trembling as he worked with his parents to climb onto Goliath's broad back. It took nearly 15 minutes, but when he finally settled astride the horse, his face shone with pure joy. And then, with infinite care, Goliath rose to his feet. Kevin's parents cried out, but Dylan raised a hand to steady them. Goliath moved with extraordinary precision, carrying the boy as if he knew exactly how fragile he was. Step by step, he circled the pasture, his massive frame swaying gently under the boy's weight. Kevin laughed, a sound that rang like music across the ranch. For 20 minutes, he rode that horse. For 20 minutes, he knew what it felt like to move, to soar, to be powerful. When Goliath lowered himself again to let Kevin dismount, the boy threw his arms around the great horse's neck, tears on his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for letting me fly." Dylan's throat tightened. He knew then that this wasn't just coincidence. This wasn't just a rescued horse. Goliath was meant for something greater. That night, Dylan sat at the kitchen table with Benjamin, his heart pounding, as he spoke his thoughts aloud for the first time. What if this is supposed to be more than just us taking care of him? What if this is a calling? A place where people can come to heal, not just to see a horse, but to find hope again. Benjamin's weathered face broke into a slow smile. "I've been waiting years to hear you say something like that. You've got vision, Dylan, and you've got the horse to make it real." It was a terrifying idea, a program, a facility, an actual mission built around one miraculous animal. Dylan had no money, no staff, no experience running anything bigger than fence repair. But the seed had been planted, and there was no turning back. The next months blurred into motion. Benjamin donated 40 acres of his land. Volunteers from town pitched in. Word spread faster than Dylan could keep up with. Stories of children speaking their first words with Goliath, veterans finding peace, grieving families discovering comfort. Donations arrived in envelopes. A local construction company offered to build new barns and paths. They called it the Goliath Recovery Ranch. Goliath became the heart of it all. Each morning, Dylan found him waiting at the gate, ready for the day's visitors. Children climbed on his back. Teenagers whispered their secrets into his mane. Soldiers with haunted eyes stood beside him, and for the first time in years, felt safe. And through it all, Dylan discovered something extraordinary. The more people Goliath helped, the stronger the horse became. Instead of tiring, he seemed energized, as if healing others fed his own spirit. Dr. Vance shook her head in wonder after each checkup. Most animals would be exhausted by this kind of constant interaction, but not him. It's like this is what he was born to do. Dylan nodded quietly, staring at the magnificent black horse who had once been left to die. Born for this, he thought. And maybe so was I. But neither man nor horse could know that the true test of their bond and their mission still lay ahead. By spring, the name Goliath Recovery Ranch had traveled far beyond Copper Ridge. What started as one man and one horse had become a beacon for families across the state, and soon across the country. Letters arrived daily, some filled with donations, others with desperate pleas. Parents wrote of children lost in silence, veterans trapped in nightmares, widows crushed by grief. They all wanted to meet the horse who seemed to carry healing in his very presence. Dylan sometimes wondered how it had happened. Just months before, he'd been a worn-out ranch hand, barely holding his life together. Now he found himself organizing schedules, answering phones, guiding visitors, and working alongside volunteers who believed as deeply as he did in Goliath's gift. But no matter how large the mission grew, the heart of it all remained the same. One black horse, waiting patiently at the pasture gate each morning, amber eyes glowing with quiet purpose. The stories became too many to count. There was the boy from Denver, autistic and silent all his life, who spent hours with Goliath before finally whispering his first words, "Goliath is my friend." His parents wept, holding each other as though afraid the moment might slip away. There was the elderly man recovering from a stroke, who shuffled slowly to the fence with his walker. Goliath lowered his massive head until it rested gently on the man's shoulder. For the first time since his stroke, the old man smiled. And there was the young woman who brought her husband, a combat veteran plagued by sleepless nights and haunted eyes. Goliath didn't need coaxing. He simply stood by the fence, his steady presence radiating safety. That night, for the first time in over a year, the man slept peacefully through till dawn. Every week brought new stories, new transformations. Dylan recorded as many as he could, knowing words could never fully capture what he saw. But the evidence was undeniable. People came broken, and somehow, through Goliath, they left lighter, stronger, braver. And though Dylan gave his heart to helping them, he knew the truth. Goliath was the healer. He was merely the caretaker. 5 years passed in a blur of work and wonder. The ranch grew into a thriving nonprofit. New barns rose, trails stretched across the land, and more horses joined the herd, each carefully chosen and trained to work alongside Goliath. Yet none matched him. His intuition remained unmatched, his presence irreplaceable. Volunteers often whispered that he wasn't just a horse, but something beyond ordinary understanding. Dylan never encouraged the talk, but deep down, he sometimes wondered the same. For Dylan himself, the transformation was as profound as anything he witnessed in others. He was no longer the lonely, broken man who once mended fences in silence. He was a leader, a teacher, and most of all, a partner to a creature who had rescued him every bit as much as he had rescued it. One evening, as he stood beside Benjamin Whitmore watching the sun sink low over the valley, the old rancher placed a hand on his shoulder. "Look what you've built, son," Benjamin said, his voice thick with pride. 5 years ago, you found a dying horse. Now you've given life to hundreds of people. You've found what you were meant to do. Dylan swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He glanced at Goliath, grazing peacefully in the pasture, and whispered, "No, we found it." Winter storms came and went, testing the ranch's strength. One brutal December morning, Dylan awoke to find the pastures buried in snow, the air so cold it seared his lungs. As he worked to break ice in the water troughs, he heard voices calling from the main road. A family trudged toward the barn, their car stranded in the drifts. 2 children clung to their parents, shivering. Dylan hurried to offer them shelter, but before he could speak, Goliath appeared behind him. The children's eyes widened in awe. "Is that him?" the older one whispered. The family had driven hours through dangerous weather, hoping the horse could help their youngest daughter, who had been paralyzed by fear since a terrible accident. Despite the snow, despite the risk, they had come seeking hope. Inside the barn, Goliath lowered himself into the straw once more. The little girl crawled beside him, resting against his great neck. She whispered to him for over an hour, her voice steadying as though she was spilling all her fears into a vessel strong enough to hold them. When the family left, she walked straighter, smiling faintly for the first time in months. Her parents clasped Dylan's hands, their eyes filled with tears. "How do you explain this?" the mother asked. Dylan looked at Goliath, who stood watching them leave with calm, amber eyes. "I can't," he admitted. "I just know it's real." Years later, Dylan would often think back to that first morning in the mist, when he'd found the giant chained to a tree with a note tied to his neck. He remembered the ragged breaths, the wounds, the hopelessness. And he remembered the moment their eyes met, the silent plea that bound them together. Now, standing in the barn of the Goliath Recovery Ranch, he watched as the horse lay with his head in the lap of a girl who had been mute since witnessing violence. She whispered to him, her lips forming words no one else had heard her speak in years. Dylan felt tears blur his vision. Beside him, Dr. Vance, now retired but still volunteering, shook her head in wonder. "I've treated animals my whole life," she said softly, "but I've never seen anything like him. It's like he was born for this work." Dylan nodded, his eyes never leaving Goliath. Born for this, and maybe everything he went through, the pain, the abandonment, the chains, maybe it all prepared him for this purpose. Dr. Vance glanced at him, her expression tender. "The same could be said about you, Dylan." That night, Dylan stood at the pasture gate where their journey had begun. Goliath came to him, pressing his massive head against Dylan's shoulder in their familiar gesture. Dylan wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, burying his face in the glossy black mane. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving me, for showing me what I was meant to do." Goliath blew softly through his nostrils, warm breath against the cold night air. Dylan smiled, certain the horse understood. Above them, the Montana sky stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like silver dust. And in that quiet darkness stood 2 souls who had found each other against all odds, a broken man and a once-forgotten giant, who together had built a kingdom of healing, born not of power or wealth, but of patience, trust, and an inexhaustible capacity for love.